I loved my wife, with the deepest sincerity of my soul. I can affirm that I loved Clara with a devotion that bordered on adoration. We had been married for 20 years, we were both couples ministry leaders at our church, and for all intents and purposes, our marriage was a model to be followed. I, Mateus, at 45, was a respected marriage counselor, a man whose words were considered a balm for homes in crisis. People looked at us on Sundays, sitting in the front pew holding hands, and saw the image of divine blessing. Little did they know that it was precisely in the most sacred place of our union, in our bedroom, on the bed that should have been an altar of honor, that I was night after night paving with my own hands our path straight to the flames of hell. And most terrifying of all, I did this believing I was celebrating love. I was blind, and the darkness that enveloped us had the sweet scent of modernity, the harmless appearance of mutual consent, and the sound of the apology so many Christian couples whisper to themselves: if it's between the two of us and we love each other, God understands. Today I am here to tell you with the dread still echoing in my spirit that God not only understands, He sees, and what He sees may be condemning millions of souls who sleep peacefully, believing they are saved. My journey into the depths began on a seemingly ordinary night, Friday, August 14, 2023. That night, we had what we called our special night. The children were at my mother-in-law's house, and we had the house to ourselves. We ordered dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and later in the bedroom, we gave ourselves to each other, but our surrender was no longer the same as it was in the early years. Subtly over time, influenced by conversations with other couples, by scenes we glimpsed in movies and TV shows, and by the incessant voice of the world screaming that pleasure must be explored without limits, we had begun to cross boundaries that we ourselves, in our right minds, would never have imagined. It started with pornography, which I justified as a tool to spice up the relationship, a poison I brought into our sanctuary, assuring Clara that it was only meant to inspire us. From inspiration, we moved on to imitation, positions that dishonored God's created order, acts that transformed the act of love into a performance of lust, where the goal was no longer the connection of souls and the celebration of unity, but a frantic search for ever more intense sensations, a silent competition to prove how free and modern we were. I, the counselor, was guiding my own wife through a labyrinth of impurity, and she, trusting me, followed. That night, after everything, we fell asleep in each other's arms, but my sleep didn't last. Around 3 a.m., I woke with a sensation I'd never experienced before. The air in the room, previously warmed by our bodies, was freezing, an abnormal, penetrating cold that didn't come from the window or the air conditioning. I tried to move, to call out for light, but my body was completely paralyzed. My eyes, however, were open, and I could see the room plunged into darkness. A primal dread gripped me. That's when I realized we weren't alone. From the denser shadows of the room near the wardrobe, two figures began to materialize. They weren't demons with horns and claws, as one might imagine. They were tall, imposing beings, but made of an absence of light, dark silhouettes that seemed to absorb what little light came through the window. Their presence was overwhelming, charged with an ancient authority and a cold, implacable judgment. I couldn't breathe. My heart seemed to have stopped. Then a voice rang out, not in my ears, but inside my mind, a voice that was neither male nor female, but multiple, like a group of judges speaking in unison, and the first sentence they handed down sealed my destiny that night. Matthew, counselor of men, but deceiver of himself, we came because of the desecration of this place, the bed that the Creator sanctified as an altar of life and unity. You transformed into a stage for the filth of the world. Honor was exchanged for lewdness, and love was used as a veil to cover the greed of your hearts. Every word was like a blade of ice piercing my soul. They knew, they saw everything. The weeping exploded within me, but no sound came out. Clara slept peacefully beside me, oblivious to the tribunal that had been established in our room. One of the shadowy figures stepped forward, and the darkness around her seemed to deepen. The Lord is merciful, but He is also a consuming fire, and because many, like you, who teach His word, are leading the flock to the abyss in the name of a false freedom, He sent us, You will not see heaven tonight. You will see the fate to which your secret practices are leading you. You will see the hell that awaits those who desecrate holy matrimony." At that instant, I felt an invisible, violent force pull my spirit from my body. I struggled with all my might, terrified. But it was useless, and then I was standing in my spirit form beside the bed, staring at my own inert body, lying next to my wife, my eyes open and glazed with pure terror. The two figures flanked me, and the room began to dissolve into darkness. The shadowy figures didn't touch me, but I felt their vacuum arms holding me with an iron grip. The room around me didn't disappear into a vortex, it rotted. The walls, painted with the silk that Clara had chosen with such care, began to sweat a dark, oily liquid that dripped down to the floor and stained the Persian rug. The beautiful crystal chandelier over the bed oxidized instantly. The lamps went out, and the crystals turned into shards of dirty glass that dangled like broken teeth. The scent of lavender and fabric softener was replaced by a fetid odor of stagnant flesh and sulfur, a stench of secrets kept for too long. I stared in horror at the bed, paralyzed body beside my sleeping wife, and watched as the Egyptian cotton sheet covering us turned gray and dusty like a shroud. The scene was a surreal nightmare, the physical representation of the spiritual rot I had cultivated in that environment. Where are we going? My mind screamed in panic. "We're going nowhere," replied the skin of voices in my consciousness. "We're only revealing what was already hidden here beneath the veneer of your hypocrisy." Then the ground beneath my spiritual feet gave way. It wasn't a fall, it was a controlled descent, as if an invisible elevator were carrying us to the sickly foundations of my own house. We passed through my bedroom floor, the living room floor below, the garages, the concrete floor of the building, and continued down through layers of rock and darkness. There were no tunnels of fire or rivers of lava. There was only a growing darkness, a silence that was filled not by the absence of sound, but by the overwhelming presence of despair. I began hearing whispers, millions of them, laments, accusations, and pleas intertwined in a cacophony of eternal pain. Finally, the descent stopped. We were in a place that resembled a vast valley of ashes under a starless sky, illuminated by a dull, twilight glow emanating from the very ground. In front of us, scattered across that desolate landscape, were countless rooms, each with a wall of transparent glass, like the windows of a macabre shopping mall. Inside each room, couples engaged in the conjugal act, but in a grotesque and desperate way. There was an animalistic urgency in their movements, a hungry search for something they could never attain, and I realized the terrible truth. They felt no pleasure. Their faces were contorted into masks of agony, frustration, and hatred. Their bodies moved, but their souls were empty, trapped in an endless cycle of unsatisfied desire. "Look closely, counselor," the voice commanded. My eyes were drawn to one of the rooms. Inside, I saw a man who on earth had been an influential pastor, a man who preached the joy of marriage. His wife was with him. He touched her, kissed her, but his eyes were fixed on a point above her, where ghostly images of other women, women from his congregations, women he secretly lusted after, danced in the air like demonic projections. He was with his wife in body, but in his mind, he attracted hundreds of others. His wife, for her part, did not see the images, but felt the emptiness. She wept silently as he used her, and her tears turned into small pebbles of salt that fell onto the bed and burned his skin. "This is the hell of veiled lust," explained one of the entities beside me. On earth, he had never committed physical adultery. He prided himself on his fidelity, but in his heart, in his marriage bed, he used his wife's body as a vessel for his impure fantasies. He transformed her into an object, desecrating the mystery of union to satisfy the lust he harbored for others. Here he is condemned to relive his sin eternally. He desires endlessly, but never finds satisfaction, and is forced to witness the pain his secret lust inflicted on his wife's soul, a pain he ignored in life. The horror of the scene struck me like a blow. How many times had I myself done something similar? How many times in Clara's arms had my mind wandered, clinging to an image, a memory, a desire that wasn't hers, and for her, I realized that the sanctity of the bed wasn't just about the body, but about the totality of being, body, mind, and spirit surrendered to one another in the presence of God. Any impure thought, any secret desire for another transformed that altar into a stage for spiritual adultery. He was forced to look into another room. There, the situation was reversed. A woman who on earth was known for her beauty and for being a perfect wife dominated her husband. She used sex not as an act of love, but as a tool of power and manipulation. She rewarded or punished him with her body, controlling his decisions, his finances, his friendships. She had turned intimacy into a weapon. In their hell, the situation repeated itself, but with a cruel difference. Each time she tried to use her power, her husband became weaker, more transparent, until he dissolved into dust before her, leaving her alone with her desire for control, a desire now no longer had anyone to exercise it over. She screamed in rage and frustration, condemned to an eternity of useless power, clutching handfuls of ash that were once her husband. I looked away, nauseated, the cold sweat of my spirit running down my back. I was guilty of all of it to varying degrees. My counseling, my books, my lectures, it was all a sham. I taught the rules, but my heart was immersed in the same transgression that I now saw being punished so literally and frighteningly. This journey is only beginning to unravel the veils. If what has been revealed so far has already shaken the foundations of your thinking, subscribe to the channel now so you don't lose the thread of this revelation and ensure you follow each step to the end. And before we proceed to the next level of this abyss, I want to propose a reflection. Leave your honest opinion in the comments. What is the fine line that for you separates intimacy that honors God from that which, even between a couple, can become a secret sin? There are no easy answers, but it is in honest dialogue that light begins to appear. Your perspective is important to our entire community. Now, prepare yourself, for we will descend even deeper. Keep walking, the voice in my mind commanded, and the dark entities urged me forward. Passing hundreds of those showcases of agony, each room was a unique trap, a distorted and eternal mirror of a secret sin cultivated in intimacy. I saw couples verbally assaulting each other during the act, their hateful words materializing like shards of glass that embedded themselves in their spiritual skin with each insult. I saw others who, in life, had indulged in practices that mimicked the violence and degradation seen in pornography, and now, in hell, were forced to relive those acts, but with real pain and no way to stop, serving as playthings for demons who mocked their pursuit of stronger pleasures. Each scene was a treatise on the perversion of holiness. My spirit trembled not only with fear, but with a sickening recognition. Fragments of my own mistakes were mirrored in each of those torments. Then, my guide stopped before a room that, at first glance, seemed different. It was silent. The couple inside didn't scream or writhe in visible agony. They simply moved with a mechanical rhythm, devoid of any emotion. Their eyes were empty and fixed on nothing. The man, an executive I recognized from a magazine article about the country's richest men, and his wife, a socialite famous for her philanthropy, performed the conjugal act with the cold efficiency of an assembly line. There was no anger, only absolute emptiness. I watched in confusion, not understanding what the torment was. Then the voice explained, "This is the hell of indifference, the transactional bed." The dark entity beside me pointed to the couple. On Earth, the love between them had died decades ago. He lived for his work, she for her social status. There was no longer any partnership, friendship, or kinship. Marriage was a social contract, a facade to keep up appearances, and the marriage bed was just another clause in that contract. For him, it was an outlet for stress, a physiological need to be fulfilled. For her, it was an obligation, the price to pay for the life of luxury and security he provided. They never talked, never prayed together, never shared their fears or dreams, simply using each other's bodies as a painkiller for the loneliness they themselves created. The act that should have been the ultimate expression of their union became the ultimate symbol of their separation. As the voice spoke, the scene inside the room changed subtly. I began to see what they saw. The man's eyes were not empty. They projected stock charts, profit and loss spreadsheets, and the faces of his competitors. He was essentially working while using his wife, Already her eyes projected jewelry store windows, yacht interiors, and the headlines of the society columns she longed to star in. She was shopping in her mind. Their bodies were together, but their souls were light years apart. And then the torment revealed itself. At the climax of the mechanical act, instead of any release, a fine, golden dust began to emanate from their bodies, floating around the room. "What is this?" I asked in my thought. "It's the substance of their souls," the voice replied. With each empty act, every moment they used their sacred union for selfish and worldly ends, a piece of their essence was ground down and turned to dust. Here they are condemned to waste away until nothing remains. They seek a relief that never comes as they slowly disintegrate, transforming into that which they valued most, him into gold dust, the symbol of their wealth. She, in diamond dust, the symbol of their status, is becoming the very vanity that consumed them until the emptiness they felt inside becomes their final and eternal state. The sight of that slow, inexorable emptying was somehow more terrifying than the explicit violence of the other rooms. It was the condemnation of the soul that dies from starvation of love, from lack of meaning, and my heart broke. I remembered the countless times I sought Clara, not out of love, but out of need. The times when, after a terrible day of counseling, listening to others' problems, I used her as a silent refuge to avoid having to talk about my own failures. The times I sought her only to relieve the tension, without asking how she was, what she felt, what her soul needed. I, too, had turned our altar into a transaction. I offered her the security of a faithful husband, and in return, I took what I needed to numb my own pain, my own emptiness. I wasn't turning her into diamond dust, but I was stealing the vitality of her soul drop by drop with my selfishness disguised as need. Is this a sin? My mind questioned, desperate for a loophole, for a justification. The answer was immediate and sharp as steel. Anything that replaces the sacrificial love of Christ at the center of the marriage bed is an idol, and all idolatry is sin, be it the idol of greed, power, vanity, or, as in this case, the idol of self. You were called to be one, to reflect the union of Christ in the church. When you use this union to serve yourselves, you mock this mystery, and the mockery will not go unpunished. A tremor ran through my spiritual being. I, Matthew, the master of the theory of Christian love, was an idolater of the first order, and my altar was covered in the ashes of my own selfish offerings. I barely had time to absorb the horrific reality of the transactional bed when the entities forced me forward, descending a slope of ash that took us to an even deeper level of that valley. The atmosphere here was different. The air vibrated with a dissonant energy, and instead of desperate silence or screams of agony, what hung in the air was a constant murmur, a hum of overlapping voices speaking incessantly, creating a wall of sound that scratched at the soul. I looked at the new gallery of showcase rooms and understood the nature of that place. Within each room, the couples were not touching, they were sitting on opposite sides of their beds, backs to back, but their mouths moved frantically, uttering words I couldn't hear but could see. The words came out of their mouths not as sound, but as swarms of tiny, barbed insects. The insects flew around the room and attacked the spouse, burrowing into their skin, their eyes, their ears, causing excruciating pain. The crueler the word, the larger and more venomous the insect, and the cycle was endless. One attacked, the other retaliated, and both lived under a perpetual cloud of their own verbal venom. My guide stopped in front of a room where the torment was particularly intense. "This is the hell of intimacy violated by the tongue, the bed of bitterness," said the multiple voice, and its very pronunciation seemed to cut the air. Inside that glass room, I recognized a couple from our old church, Andre and Juliana. They had moved to another city a few years ago, but I remembered them. They seemed the perfect couple, successful, committed to the church, always smiling. No one would ever suspect. Here, however, the facade had crumbled. Andre was huddled in a corner of the bed, his spiritual body covered in black wasps that buzzed and stung him incessantly. They emanated from Juliana's mouth, who was sitting on the other end. Her face was a mask of contained fury. "Watch what she says," my guide ordered, and suddenly I could hear her words in my mind. They were accusations, criticisms, words of contempt that she had kept bottled up in life and now released without filter. You were never man enough for me, your dreams were small, your touches weak, I deserved more, I sacrificed myself for you, and you gave me this mediocre life. Each sentence was a wasp joining the swarm that tortured Andre, but he wasn't just a victim. His mouth also moved, and from his lips came translucent, venomous scorpions that flew and stuck themselves into Juliana, who writhed in agony. I heard your words too. You were a well of insecurity, nothing ever satisfied you. I worked like an animal to give you everything, and you only knew how to complain. Your bitterness drained my soul. You killed the love I felt for you with your constant venom. The scorpions dug their stingers into her, and I could feel the pain of both, a pain that was not just physical, but emotional. The pain of rejection, of failure, of humiliation. On Earth, the entity continued. They learned the art of silent warfare. To the world, they were an exemplary couple, but in the intimacy, in the silence of the bedroom, their tongues became a weapon. He belittled her with sarcasm. She castrated him with criticism. They used the bed not for love, but for settling scores. Every flaw, every mistake from the past was brought to the surface and used as ammunition. Sexual intercourse was rare, and when it did occur it was cold, a temporary truce in a war that never ended. They desecrated the bed by transforming it into a courtroom, a battlefield where the goal was not union, but victory. The last word, the infliction of pain. The voice paused, and the darkness around us seemed to thicken. The Creator's word says that the tongue is a small fire that sets a great forest ablaze. They burned down the sanctuary of their marriage with hellfire, and now they dwell in that fire forever. They are condemned to wound each other with the essence of their own bitterness, never able to touch or let go. The desire for intimacy remains, but it is stifled by the terror of pain, which they know will come from each other's mouths. A chill ran through my core. I knew Andre and Juliana's words. They weren't the same, but the spirit behind them was. I remembered the nights when Clara and I would argue. I remembered how I, the counselor, used my skill with words to twist arguments, to make her feel guilty, to win the fight, even though I knew I was wrong. I remembered my cutting silence when I was upset, a silence that screamed contempt and punishment, forcing her to come to me asking for forgiveness for something I had caused. I didn't create visible scorpions, but my words and my silence were equally poisonous and clear. I remembered the times when her pent-up frustration would explode in veiled criticisms, in comparisons to other husbands, in sighs of disappointment that were more painful than a scream. We were doing the same thing, we were waging the same war, only with more subtlety, with more of a Christian veneer, but the poison was the same. The bitterness was there, piling up under the rug, waiting for the right moment to strike. I realized, with a horror that dried up my spiritual throat, that hell wasn't just a place of punishment for grotesque acts, but also the final and eternal distillation of the subtle poisons we cultivate in our hearts and pour out on those we should love most, especially in the place that should be the safest of all. We left behind the valley of glass rooms, and the entities guided me down a narrow, dark corridor, where the only sound was the ghostly echo of the laments we had witnessed. I was numb, a defendant who already knows he's condemned, awaiting only the reading of the sentence. With each step, the darkness deepened until we reached a place that defied logic. It was a hall of infinite proportions, vast and cavernous, yet completely silent. The floor was a polished black mirror, reflecting a vaulted ceiling so high it was lost in the darkness, and throughout the hall, suspended in the air by invisible threads, were crystal spheres the size of a human heart. There were billions of them, perhaps trillions, each one pulsing with a faint, dull light. Within each sphere, I could see miniature scenes, moments in the life of couple. There were weddings, births of children, family dinners, arguments, and reconciliations. It was a museum of marital memories. Where are we? My mind asked wearily. The answer from the entity beside me was solemn and terrible. You are in the sanctuary of denied supplications. This is the hell of those who used prayer as a tool of witchcraft in the marriage bed. The word witchcraft shocked me. I associated it with pagan rituals, not the prayer of a Christian. There is no greater witchcraft than trying to bend God's will to satisfy the desires of your own selfish heart, the voice explained, as if reading my confusion, and there is no altar more desecrated than a couple's bedroom where one of the spouses kneels, not to intercede in love, but to demand in greed. My guides led me to one of the suspended crystal spheres. Inside, I saw a woman. She was a worship leader at her church, known for her angelic voice and apparent devotion. The sphere showed scenes of her and her husband. He was a good, simple man, an honest worker, but he didn't share her ministerial ambition. I saw her kneeling beside the bed while her husband slept. She prayed fervently, with tears in her eyes, but when the entity's voice allowed me to hear the content of her prayer, my spirit froze. She wasn't asking God to bless her husband, but to break him. She asked that he lose his mediocre job so that he would be forced to depend on God and consequently become involved in her ministry. She asked that God make him bolder, more spiritual, more like the husband of another worship leader she envied. Her prayers were not intercessions of love they were a list of demands that God reshape her husband in the image of her own desires and vanities. She didn't want the man God gave her, she wanted a project she could mold for her own glory. Prayer of control sentenced the entity. She used the sacred channel of communication with the Creator to try to manipulate her husband's free will. She didn't love him as he was, she loved the idealized version she had constructed in her mind. And that's why she's here. Then her torment manifested. The crystal sphere next to hers lit up with a brilliant, pure light. Inside I saw a vision of what their life could have been. I saw her husband, with his simple job, teaching their children the value of honesty. I saw the family laughing happily in a modest but peaceful home. I saw the genuine joy his simplicity would bring to her life if she had only accepted it. The woman in his sphere was forced to witness this vision of paradise lost. She screamed, banging on the crystal, trying to reach that reality of peace, but she was trapped in her own world of ambition, frustrated, condemned to relive her manipulative prayers and eternally witness the happiness she herself rejected. I staggered away. My job as a counselor was largely to teach couples to pray for each other, but how did I teach them? I instructed them to pray for their spouse to change, pray for your wife to be more submissive, pray for your husband to be a better spiritual leader, pray for him to stop that hobby you dislike. I was unknowingly teaching witchcraft. I was encouraging people to use prayer as a hammer, to chisel their partners into a sculpture of their liking, instead of teaching them to pray for the grace to love the person God gave them, with all their flaws and virtues. And I had done the same with Clara. I remembered the early mornings when I knelt in frustration, asking God to make her more understanding of my long work hours, to make her less anxious about finances, to make her more passionate in our intimacy, on my terms. Each of those prayers was not an act of love, but an act of supreme selfishness. I wasn't asking God to bless her, I was asking him to adjust her to my needs. I was treating my wife as a problem to be fixed by divine intervention, not as a gift to be loved unconditionally. In that infinite hall of crystal hearts, I didn't need to be shown my sphere. I already had it in my mind, and the torment of paradise lost it contained was a pain I was already beginning to feel, an agony of regret that was deeper than any physical torment. The entities turned to me, and the darkness around them seemed to contract. You saw the sins of others reflected in yours, the voice said. You saw the greed, the indifference, the bitterness, and the witchcraft of the heart. Now it's time to look not at the reflection, but directly at the source. The sanctuary of denied supplications dissolved into crystal dust and silence. The entities didn't drag me, nor did they push me. Instead, the very ground beneath my feet shifted, carrying me like a conveyor belt of darkness, through an absolute void. As the landscape solidified again, spiritual nausea hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was in a terribly familiar place. It was a perfect replica of my office, the place where I received couples and offered them my poisoned wisdom. Every detail was there, down to the leather chair where I sat, the comfortable sofa for couples, the bookshelf with my books and diplomas, the coffee table with a box of tissues, but everything was corrupted. The leather of the armchair was cold and sticky, like reptile skin. The titles of my books on the shelf now glowed with an evil glow, and instead of The Art of Christian Marriage, I was reading the Manual of Consensual Desecration. My gold-framed diplomas were written in a hellish script that writhed like worms, and where my name should have been was the word accuser. The air that in my earthly office was scented with a faint cedar scent to calm clients, smelled of musty paper and dried tears, and sitting on the sofa, waiting for me, were a man and a woman. My spiritual self recoiled in shock. They were Daniel and Sophia, a young couple I had counseled about a year ago. They arrived at my office on the verge of divorce, and I saved them. I was the hero of their story. "Sit down, counselor," the voice of the entities echoed, no longer beside me, but from every corner of the room. An invisible force pushed me into the cold leather chair. I tried to resist, to scream that I was no longer that man, but my spiritual body obeyed against my will. Daniel and Sophia looked at me with empty eyes, the same hope-filled eyes I'd seen a year ago, but now devoid of any light. "We're in trouble, Mateus," Daniel said, his voice monotonous as an automaton. "My wife, she no longer desires me. Intimacy has become an obligation." It was the same complaint he brought me to earth, and then the horror began. I opened my mouth to tell them the truth, to scream at them to repent, to return to simplicity, to holiness, but the words that came out weren't mine. It was my voice, but the script was from hell itself. "Daniel," I heard myself say in a calm, professional tone, "passion is like a bonfire, sometimes you need different fuel. You've tried exploring your fantasies safely, sure, maybe watch a movie together, something to inspire. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as it's between the two of you. God has given you pleasure to enjoy." As I spoke, I saw a dark mist form in the air between Daniel and Sophia. Within the mist, the same ghostly images of lust I'd seen in the first valley began to dance, whispering filthy suggestions in his ears. Sophia flinched, but Daniel stared at the images with a sickly gleam of interest. My words, which on earth had seemed so wise and modern, here were the incantation that summoned demons. I wanted to stop, to bite my own spiritual tongue, but strength compelled me to continue. "And you, Sophia?" my traitorous voice continued, you need to be honest with your feelings, don't repress your frustration, communication is key, tell him what hurts you, don't keep it to yourself." Instantly, the wasps and scorpions I saw in the bed of bitterness began to emerge from Sophia's mouth, attacking Daniel, who screamed silently. My words of healthy communication became the weapons for their marital war. Hell wasn't just showing me the results of my sins, it was forcing me to be the priest of its rituals. I was the executioner, forced to use the same tools of deception I used in life. The session continued, and each piece of advice I gave was a new plague on the couple. When I suggested they reversed roles to understand each other's perspective, I saw a shadow of power transfer from Daniel to Sophia, and their bed became the stage for manipulation. When I talked about scheduling intimacy to avoid letting routine win, I saw their bed become transactional, and the dust of their souls began to let go. I was there in my own personalized torture chamber, actively recreating their fall, feeling their pain as if it were my own, powerless to stop the venom flowing from my own mouth. The height of the torment was when, at the end of the session, my mouth curved into the same comforting smile I wore on earth and said, "Don't worry. Pray about it, ask God to change each other's hearts," and in that instant, I saw his crystal sphere form in the sanctuary of denied supplications, and their prayers became spells against each other. I wasn't just a sinner, I was a fabricator of sinners, a blind guide who not only fell into the hole, but dug the hole himself and convinced others to jump in. A scream finally tore through my spiritual paralysis, a sound of pure agony and self-loathing. "Stop, please. Stop," but the scene just started over again. Daniel and Sophia looked at me again with their empty eyes, and Daniel's voice rang out again, "We're in trouble, Mateus." I was trapped in an eternal cycle of